So this is part 2 of my taking way too long surreal colored pencil piece. So for today, we're going to be working on the background and on the cat, and then I'll do the fish next week. Last week was the corals. I will put a link to that in the video description. I've also got a link in the video description of how I designed this layout. And actually, what I designed that night didn't end up being what I went with. I was able to change it, but you can see how you can come up with designs in Photoshop or similar apps to get a similar look. Similar is apparently the word of the day. So what I'm doing here, I am taking a midnight blue color. This is actually the Derwent Pro color. Now, you don't have to use the same colors I'm using. You don't have to use the same pencils I'm using, but it's just a kind of a bluish, I don't want to say neutral. It's not close to purple on the color wheel though, this blue. And the reason that I went with the Derwent Pro color, this is one of the light fast of that set. These pencils are somewhere between a wax and an oil base, and the color is amazing. It blends out really easily. Originally, I had planned on, my shirt makes it look like I'm wearing feathers there. Nice. But anyway, I get distracted easily. So I had planned on airbrushing this background. The problem was, or not even a problem, but when I came up with this design, when I changed what I thought I was going to do, my initial design, I thought I was going to have a lot more background color showing than what I did. So once I changed the design and realized there's not a whole lot of background, it would have taken me longer. One of the reasons I use airbrush is it saves time. It's not even an issue of this looks better. It's more often than not I do it because it's a time saver. But sometimes it does look better. It depends on what it is. But the reason that I went with or was going to airbrush this is I had a large area to fill in, but as I change the design, there's not a whole lot of this blue background that I need. So it was going to take me more time to mask out the areas I didn't want the airbrush to get onto with masking fluid and Frisket. All of those products that I use would have taken so much more work. So it was actually a lot easier just to fill this in. And the pencils that I chose to go with were ones that I knew would blend out really, really well. I could be messy. You can see all my pencil strokes going every which direction. It really isn't going to show once I start blending out. So I started with this base layer. Again, you can see I'm moving pretty messy. Don't push hard on this layer though. I mean, I'm giving it I'd say a medium amount of pressure. It's not super, super light, but you don't want to push hard enough that you start flattening out or damaging the tooth of the paper. One, it's just not going to blend that well. You're not going to get enough pigment on there to really get the color saturation that I'm going for here. But the bigger thing is you're not going to be able to get additional layers. So it really does limit you if you push too hard too soon. Now, typically you hear me talk about keep your pencil really sharp so it gets into all the nooks and crannies of the paper. And by the way, this one is the Fabriano Artistico Extra White Hot Press 140-pound watercolor paper. This is about a 12 by 16. But I normally will say keep your edge, you can see here, there's areas where there's hot start and stop points. It'll all blend out with the colors that I'm using are going to be so dark. Now, let's say I was doing something with lighter yellows, I'd probably be a little bit cleaner. Certain colors, they don't hide your pencil strokes as well, but I'm going so dark on this, it really isn't a problem. Plus, with the newer batches of the Fabriano, that is one thing I like about the Fabriano, or the newer ones. They blend really, really smoothly, really easily compared to before. And they blended well before, but that is one thing that did improve, I think, when they changed how they make it. Overall, I think I'd still prefer it to be the old way, but this newer batches, they are growing on me. I thought I wouldn't end up replacing this paper, but I don't know. There are some things that I definitely like working on it. I like being able to be super lazy, but combine this paper with using pencils that have a bit more wax to it. So I'm using the Pro Color here, and I believe I used some, we'll see as I get going, some of the Derwent Lightfast, and definitely a lot of the Derwent drawing pencils. So Derwent Drawing, if you're not familiar with those are extremely waxy, very opaque. They are almost buttery, I guess would be a good way as you're working with them. They lay down so fast, and when you blend, because so much pigment ends up on the paper, when you blend with odorless mineral spirits, it really takes over nicely. You get these really deep, rich colors. And then so for the Derwent Drawing, it's an ink blue color that really worked well for what I was going here. Now, I'm not so picky where I'm going to sit there and spend hours trying to find the perfect blue pencil. It doesn't matter. What I care about and what I suggest you care a bit more about are your values. Are your darks dark enough, your lights light enough? That's what's going to make all the difference in the world in your work. The blue colors I'm using, they're all fairly similar, that midnight blue color right around there, even though some of these have different names. But it's not a big deal to me that I have the absolute perfect blue. I just need something, if I get my values right, this is all going to work together really nicely. I could have even gone with a purplish blue and it would have worked with the coral and the rest of the piece. So don't work yourself up about, I need to know the exact color. That's not what's going to make a difference in your work. What's going to make the difference is, are your darks dark enough and your lights light enough? I'm going to go ahead and speed this up quite a bit because I'm just repeating the same. Being sloppy, messy, pencil strokes going every which direction. Notice how I outline my subject before I start filling it in. That lets me keep my edges nice and clean. And I want to make sure I pull these pencil strokes right up to the subject. Now, something that a lot of people have a tendency to do is create an unintentional halo effect. Now, sometimes that looks amazing where you've got that light glow around the subject. If it's intentional, go for it. But what I've seen happen a lot with colored pencil, I think more so than a lot of other mediums, but you're afraid to accidentally get this color on top of the cat or somewhere where you didn't want it. And so you don't go all the way up to the edge. I would rather see you overlap this color onto the subject than not quite touch the subject and have this kind of outer glow that isn't supposed to be there. So once I filled that in, now I'm going through, this is the black from the Derwent drawing. So again, very waxy. Look how I'm holding the pencil to the side. Actually, no, I switched. That one looks like it's the Derwent Light Fast Black. But I'm holding it to the side. This is typically going to give you a very rough, grainy, gritty look. But the way that I'm layering, again, these pencils on this paper, everything from the Derwent drawing, Light Fast, and what was the other one? The Pro Color. These ones just blend out so well. I sound like a commercial for them right now. Don't worry, I'm going to be using my other pencils today too. But for this background, it really does go on smoothly. And you can use your polychromos, you can use your luminance, they're all going to work just fine. You may have to put a few extra layers if you use your polychromos for a background like this to get the color saturation as dark as I'm going to get very quickly. I'm pulling this black up pretty far. So I wanted a softer kind of a grayish blue, like a more muted. I'm not going for anywhere near as bright as what I've got in the corals. I really want the corals to be the thing that stands out here. So I'm just lightly going over this with the side. Now, I wouldn't typically recommend using the side of the pencil like that for your base layer because it's really not going to get into all the nooks and crannies of the paper. But it just hits the top of the tooth, and that's why it ends up looking grainy or gritty. But because I already have that base layer of this dark blue on there, I'm just tinting the color at that point. So when I blend out with the odorless mineral spirits, this black is just going to blend in with the blue, which really is in all of those nooks and crannies. Now, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, if you're new to colored pencil, the papers that we use, they have what we call tooth to them. They're kind of bumpy. There's little hills and valleys in that paper, and we want to make sure that that pencil gets into all those little nooks and crannies. If you don't, and the pencil is only hitting the top of the tooth of that paper, that's what gives you that grainy, gritty look. Now, the odorless mineral spirits, to an extent, will fix a lot of that because it causes the pigment to kind of dissolve into the paper. But as much as possible, we really do want to get a lot of the pencil itself into those nooks and crannies for the best results, for the smoothest results. The type of paper, the type of pencils, all of that is going to have an impact on what that end result is. So there is with the black. And there, that one is the black Derwent drawing. Really wish they'd make those in more colors. See, here I'm not being super careful. I've been pretty careful around the edges with the blue. The blue is the main thing that is like stuck into the paper right now. This is just, I'm not using a heavy hand, so it's just kind of sticking on top of or setting on top of the blue. Now, when blending with the odorless mineral spirits, one of the best things you can do for yourself if you want the best results, get a lot of pigment on that paper. That's why you can see I keep going over the same areas again and again and again. So when I blend out, I'm going to have the best results. And it's still going to take a couple, 2, 3 times repeating this process to get to the end result that I want. But if I can get a lot of that pencil onto the paper when I blend with the odorless mineral spirits, I'm going to get the really nice, dark, rich colors. If I don't have very much pencil on the paper, I mean, it's all filled in with the blue. You can see that it's there, but I haven't gone over it and over it and over it like what you're seeing me do here. When you blend out with the odorless mineral spirits, it just kind of looks faded and you don't get the richness that I'm going to get. That's usually the problem that people have when they say that the odorless mineral spirits isn't working for them. It's because there's not enough pencil on the paper. Look at how many times I go back over the same areas again and again, and I'm doing it the same with, or using the same pencils, the blacks and the blues. Even if I just go over the same area with the same colored pencil, the point is I want to get a lot of pigment on that paper so that the odorless mineral spirits have something to work with. If there's not enough pigment, it just can't do a whole lot. So now we can go ahead and blend with the odorless mineral spirits. I'm going to use a Taklon bristled filbert brush. The one that I've been using for years. It's by Low Cornell. I cannot find a link to that anywhere, but any, like even generic, something that's a Taklon bristled filbert is my favorite. I do have some smaller flat brushes, and again, just Taklon bristled brushes. Not too stiff, not too soft. But this brush works for most things that I need. Or this size, I should say. Now for these first few layers, as I'm blending with odorless mineral spirits, I'm going to have more on my paintbrush. It'll be a lot more wet. As I get into future layers or more once this layer dries and I go on again, there's one of those smaller brushes. But as I continue layering like this, put more pigment or more pencil on the paper and then blend with the OMS, I'm going to use less and less odorless mineral spirits on my brush. And the reason for that is if you have a lot of pigment already on the paper and then you put a lot of odorless mineral spirits back on top of it, you end up sliding that pigment around and kind of lifting it off the paper instead of what you're trying to do. So just remember, each additional time of blending, use less and less. So I just dry it off on a piece of either Viva paper towel or an old rag. Regular paper towels do not play nicely with odorless mineral spirits. It just kind of spreads. They're not effective. But I will dry it off on Viva or an old rag, and that will help dry off the brush a bit every time I dip it into the container of odorless mineral spirits. You can see I'm being pretty careful around the fish. Now, if I get out of the lines, if I make a mess, it's not a huge deal. I've got my titanium white touch-up texture mixture that I use where I can come back through and clean up edges and harshen things up much easier than I could without that product. So I have a bit of freedom for being a bit messier than I would normally be if I didn't have that as kind of a safety net. We're going to go ahead and speed this up a bit because it's just a repeat of what I've already done. Same type of brush strokes. All of that is the same. Now I do want to watch if I've got a lot of pigment on that paper, and especially with the really waxy pencils like the Derwent Drawing, I'm going to be very likely to have brush strokes with the odorless mineral spirits, more so than like the polychromos, or if I had less pigment on the paper. So I am going to have to watch that as I work out, just kind of blend over anywhere where I have brush strokes that I don't want them to be. Now, I don't need this to be perfectly smooth. If I wanted perfectly smooth, that's where I would have gone with the airbrush. But then it would have been easier if I wanted a perfect gradient here. I just want kind of a soft, fuzzy look. So I'm okay if there are some brush strokes as long as they're soft. I'm still being pretty careful around the edges, except when I get into the cat's fur. See how I'm intentionally pulling that up into the fur on the chest there, because that's going to be such a soft, fluffy area. It actually looks better if I go ahead and smudge it now than if I try to keep it too crisp like I'm doing on the edges of the fish. One of the things that you really want to start watching on your artwork is which lines should be harsh versus which lines should be soft. That's a big, big deal and will make a big difference in how much depth your work has. When we first start painting and drawing, we have a tendency to want every single line ever to be harsh and clean and crisp. You don't want that. You want some of them. I mean, okay, on the coral, I did want all of those to be pretty crisp for the most part because they're all the same, I guess, distance from the viewer. But when you want to start creating depth, like here with the cat, I've got to watch where do I want it to be soft and where do I want harsh lines. And in most things, you're going to have a combination of both. So I let that background dry completely, and now I'm going back over it. This is that ink blue with the Derwent drawing. This is really going to give me that more muted look that I want. And I just put a piece of glassine up. That glassine is kind of like wax paper, except it's archival, acid-free. Nothing will stick to it. So I'm not going to smudge my work. It's also going to keep me from resting my hand on my paper itself, which keeps the oils from my skin off my artwork. The oils from your skin, not archival. We want to make sure we keep our hands off, or, we don't want that to get on our work. Even if your hands are perfectly clean, you're constantly going to be producing a bit of that oil. So we do want to keep that off our work as much as we can. The glassine, it's fairly inexpensive. I get it from Amazon, and a roll of that stuff. Occasionally you'll see a roll on there that's like $50 or $60. I don't think I've ever spent more than $15 on a roll, and those rolls last a really long time. You can also use it to put in between your artwork if you're storing them in like an archival art box or something like that. You can use the glassine in between each piece so that you don't have smudging, and it just kind of protects everything. Or when shipping stuff, if you need to put a piece of paper on top of your artwork, this is a great way to go. Again, just using that ink blue everywhere. I'm going over where I previously put the black and the lighter midnight blue. Now, I could have started just with this ink blue. I forgot that I had a blue that was so similar. This is really more the color that I was going for in this one. So I could have just started with this. I think it would have saved a little bit of time just because this pigment lays down. It's so waxy, lays down really quickly. And it took me, I want to say, an hour or two to do this whole background. And it's a decent size, but it does go really fast when you use those waxier pencils, I find, versus just straight oil base. So now I'm using the black. This is the Derwent Drawing Black. I find that the Derwent Drawing Black, it goes down super dark, but it's also got almost a grayish tint to it. I don't know if it's like a wax bloom or what it is, but it always feels like it's not as dark as my Polychromos Black. Of course, it takes a lot less work to get it very dark. Now as I'm blending, there's hardly any, compared to the previous layers anyway, odorless mineral spirits on this brush. Now, if you are working on black paper, when you go over with the odorless mineral spirits, it's going to make your colors look a lot darker until it dries. Just because the OMS kind of makes the pigment a little bit more translucent, so it shows the dark background, the dark background will show through a bit more, but let it dry and it'll lighten back up. Now, I did have some people ask if I was going to use, when I was doing the initial design, why wouldn't I just use black paper since the black cat, the dark background. The problem with that was going to be there was no way I was going to get these corals as bright as what I needed. I don't need the cat to be super bright. I could have anywhere where I needed it to be lighter, use the touch-up texture titanium white mixture, but on the coral, that would be so much in order to get all of those bright, vivid colors. So with colored pencils, it is really hard to get that kind of fluorescent tone that we want with corals. It can be a bit hard to achieve with colored pencils because the light fast colors aren't going to be really, really bright. Usually. There are exceptions. But for the most part, like the hot pink colors and those that you see out, I think Prismacolor has some, those are not light fast at all. So if I can't use those on my work, I need my coral to be as bright as I can possibly get it, and that's going to happen going on top of very light colored paper. Going on top of black, all of these will have a much more, they'll still be pretty, but they would be much more dull. And with coral, the thing I'm really going for was that as bright as I can get them look. And so definitely working on white paper was the way to go. Yeah, it makes a little bit more work for me when I get onto the cat and when I get onto the background here, but there's no way I was going to get the coral to be this bright without it. And at this stage of the video, the coral actually looks a little bit dull just because of my camera lighting. That'll get fixed later. So this was a part of the live stream. We're going to just go through this super quickly. You can go watch this. I'll have the link in the description. But the live stream, this was all real time, so you can see exactly how I was moving my pencils, what colors I'm using, all of that is there. But I'm starting off with the eye. I usually, when I work with pet portraits, I will either start with the inside of the ear, one, because I hate drawing ears. I don't know what it is about ears. I do not enjoy them. And that will usually be one of the darkest portions of the portrait. Although with the cat, there's not much. These are super easy ears and they're not that dark. But if I start with something that's really dark, it makes it easier for me to judge my values. On this one, judging my values isn't hard. There's so much that is as black as I can get it. So I started with the eye and I'm just working that pencil around to start building up where the dark portions of the fur are going to go. Now notice how I'm moving that brush stroke. They're all, or I say brush stroke, but pencil stroke, slight curves. They're not perfectly straight lines. Perfectly straight lines, and it's going to look really stiff and unnatural. Every single pencil stroke that I'm doing here is slightly curved. Don't worry, the rest of the video, once we get through the live stream, is not going to move this fast. They actually prefer drawing tabby marked cats or like brindle dogs, that sort of thing. The stripes are a lot more fun to me to draw. It's easier to build up the depth. It's a little bit harder, I think, on a solid animal to get that. It's hard to get that kind of detail. And especially in this case, this is a long haired cat. So she's just a big ball of fluff. And so trying to capture that fluff, you're not going to want as many harsh pencil strokes as you would on a short haired cat or even a tabby marked cat. So you've got to balance how many pencil strokes you want to show, like where do you want them to be harsh and where do you want them to be soft so she looks fluffy. Now here, I don't have to worry about any colors. I'm just getting a general idea of where the dark areas are going to go and which direction her hair moves in. I don't need to sit and count, okay, 15 strands of fur going this direction and then 15 this direction. It's not that big of a deal. I want to get a general feel for what direction the fur is moving in, how long and short each pencil stroke needs to be. And sometimes it's not even a pencil stroke, it's little circles like that softness where I'm just filling it in softly, like you can see on the shadow on the side of her nose and next to her eye. So this is after the live stream. We'll go ahead and slow that down. Now I'm still using my black polychromos and I'm going through, the reason that I went with the black polychromos for the detail in the fur is it just sharpens to such a fine point, and it's one of my favorite blacks as far as the tone that black has. I really do like that pencil. So I'm using that and just really lightly going over now, even though it's still black on black. I'm not pushing very hard, so I'm getting a really soft look for where these lighter areas are going to be. Now the trick here when you're drawing animals that are black is do not think that all of your highlights, like you would think, well, lighter than black, so grays and whites. If you do that, the animal is going to end up looking dusty and old. You want them to look shiny and sleek and so, I mean, sometimes it is an older animal, so you would include grays, but keep that in mind. If the cat is not that old, doesn't have any gray. I don't even know. Do cats really get gray? No, dogs do. But can you tell I've not had a cat in a really long time? But if you start adding those, and it's the same thing when you draw people. If you add gray or as the highlight in dark hair, you now just made them look a lot older than what they may actually be, unless it does call for gray hair, of course. So I'm going to bring in a lot of blues and purples for those highlights instead of grays. Yeah, the reference photo calls for gray. That is absolutely what those highlights look like. But as an artist, if I put those in there, she's not going to have that really clean, very shiny look to her. But yeah, if you're doing pet portraits or looking for a reference photo to use of a cat, don't be deterred. I cannot talk today. Detoured. That's not it either. Deterred. Whatever. You know what I'm trying to say. Don't kind of hold back from drawing a cat that is striped or the tabby markings that looks like it's more detail. It's easier to make those ones look good than it is a solid colored cat or dog. I like doing both. I know a lot of people will look at them and go, oh my gosh, it's so much detail. Yeah, but it's easier to make. It really is easier to make it look good because there's so much to hide mistakes. Whereas a solid colored animal, there's not a whole lot to hide anything that didn't quite work out as planned. I'm putting a little bit more pressure onto that pencil where I want it to be a bit darker, but not too much more. Mostly, I just want to keep layering over that area again and again and again to darken it up versus adding too much pressure. I'd go back to flattening the tooth of my paper, which does limit how hard I can push. So I look at this stage as pretty much mapping things out. I don't need the perfect color. Obviously, I don't have any of the purples and blues in yet. I need to know where are my lights, where are my darks, how does the hair move around to see how it changes direction. That's a big thing. I see beginner artists do a lot where they'll make one or two pencil strokes for fur and it looks great and they think, okay, now I just need to repeat that all over again, all over the place. Well, now it just looks like confetti. You want variation. Watch the direction that the fur it's going to move and change constantly throughout all over the place. I mean, even when I start working on the fur on around her neck, it changes directions all over the place. Watch for that. So I'm going to take this purple tone and go right over the black, mostly the area that's going to be the light, but I can go over the dark black too. It's just not going to show up over that. But the lighter areas now, I can start tinting that color. And there's not a whole lot of rhyme or reason as to where I'm using blue versus purple. Need that to be a bit darker, so back with the black. I just want to get some variation in there with blue and purple. Now the way that I'm going to do the fur on top of this with the highlights requires me to go a bit darker on the base layers here. So that when I come through with the highlights will really show up. If I stay too safe, if I'm trying to be really safe and keep everything really neutral, it's going to affect the ability of my light colors to stand out enough. So sometimes you have to be a bit brave there and go a lot darker than you think you want, or darker than you know you want that end result to be. Now, often with colored pencils, I'll say go lighter than you think you need to be, and you can always go back and darken. You absolutely can. But I knew in this case, because it's such a dark cat, and I'm going to be using my lighter pencils on top of the dark to pull those highlights out, my darks have to be dark enough for that to work in the first place. As long as I didn't get them dark by pushing too hard. That's the only time it's really going to cause a problem for me. And even on this one, on if you look at the finished, well, not finished, but where I stopped for this painting, the her highlights I may pull out a little bit brighter. I'm really not sure until I get the fish in. Right now she's a little bit darker on her highlights than what the reference photo has, especially on her chest. But I'm not sure that I want that to be as light as it was with the lighting in the reference photo. It may not work out well. It might draw too much attention to the fur around her neck, where I really would prefer the attention to be around her face and eyes. So that is something I might go back and touch up. I'm not sure yet. Going over the background where I wasn't, it was a little bit blotchier than what I wanted. I could see too much of the grainy, gritty bits of the paper. So I'm using that ink blue again. I'm just going to go right over that. Now here, when I blend with the odorless mineral spirits, I want to make sure there is barely anything on that brush because it will lift too much or spread around too much of the previous layers, because now I'm at a point on that background where I have so much pigment on it. So here, look at how her face looks like crayon. That is normal. We're just not going to leave it there. So when you get to this stage on your work, don't feel like, oh my gosh, I'm just not doing a good job. I'm never going to make this look good and give up. Don't do that. That just means you're not finished yet. Keep working, keep layering. This is a layering process. This is not a paint by number where every pencil stroke, as long as it's in the right place, right color, is done. That's how you end up painting a cat that looks like plastic. We're going to layer to get this softness where one brush stroke is going to overlap onto another, and then you'll blend it with the OMS. If you're not sure, I keep saying OMS and odorless mineral spirits. It's the same thing. OMS is just your abbreviation for that. Now her ears, because they're so fluffy, oh, they might have been the easiest ears of an animal I have ever drawn. Besides maybe a bird, because you can't see theirs. I'm using brown on the inside of her ear here because it is lighter. The light comes through, the skin is really thin there. So I'm going with brown, not just black. But I also don't want to just jump to pink, which sometimes you would think on the inside of the ear. She's a black cat, so it's not going to be that light. But I do want it lighter and a warmer tone than what that black is going to be. Bit of that purple. And you don't have to use the same purple. You don't even have to use the same colored pencils. Get your darks dark enough and your lights light enough. And see how here I'm still moving that pencil in the direction of the fur. So if I have any pencil strokes show, they need to go the right direction. Although really all that gets blocked in pretty dark. So you're not going to see a whole lot. I'm going to go ahead and speed this up a little bit because I'm just repeating the same process. Pay attention to where my light areas go, where do my dark areas go. Mostly focusing on that black pencil still. I should probably put that in a pencil extender. That's getting pretty short. But look at all of these I keep saying brush strokes, these pencil strokes. Look at how all of them are slightly curved. Well, except for right there where I'm just filling in solid. But where I'm getting those actual, like it works with her fur, look how they're all slightly curved. We don't want a bunch of straight lines. And you're going to go through stages where I ended with the live stream actually looked pretty good. Well, minus the big black blotch on the side of her face. But I mean, for the most part, it looked pretty cool. Once I continue layering it in, it looks way worse. Now it looks like crayon. It looks absolutely terrible. As you're working, you're going to go from having it look pretty cool to super terrible. Don't let that scare you. You have to go through those super terrible stages to get to that more realistic end result. So I'm taking this purple, going over everything here. I'm going over the light and the dark. I don't even have to be careful. I just want to get this purple tint in there. It's not really going to even show up over the really dark areas, so there's no reason for me to save time and try to make sure it only goes on the light areas. You're not even going to notice that it's on the dark. I am a big fan of saving time whenever possible. I want to save time, but I don't want the work or the end result to suffer. So that's kind of the distinction there when you're trying to find corners that you can cut. If those corners start affecting the work negatively, then don't cut those corners. But if I can save time, that is the way I want to go and still have it look good. This is the same as that background. Remember what I was talking about. We want to make sure that we've got enough pigment on that paper before we blend out with odorless mineral spirits. So look how many times I've gone over and over and over the same areas with pencils before I blend even once. Here is that Derwent Drawing Black, because it is going to add so much pigment to the dark areas. So now with the odorless mineral spirits, especially on this background here, I'm going back over. I don't want very much on my brush, but I'm going to reload that brush with the odorless mineral spirits once I get onto the cat, because that's my first layer of blending, so it's easier if I use a bit more. I don't really have to worry about it lifting too much at that point. It's just going to soak into the paper. But here, where I was going over that background, that I definitely want a fairly dry brush. Now as I move on to the cat, my brush can have far much of the odorless mineral spirits on it. So now it's starting to even look worse. I'm losing any brush strokes that I had. You can still see them a bit in person, but I'm starting to lose a lot of those brush strokes that I put in on the first day of the live stream. Now, here's a big deal, and I'm going to talk about this. I'm sure I'll bring it up several times throughout this piece. When you get to this stage, don't think that just because color is on it, that stage is finished. I mean, yeah, okay, we've got some highlights, we've got some shadows. It's not done. I need hours and hours and hours of work on those areas before that would actually be done. Don't fall into that stage of there's color, it's done, because it's not. Look at the difference between here, just because there's color on it, versus once I had that cat finished. It makes a really big difference if you'll just keep working on it, spend more time, slow down. The videos that we do, the time-lapse videos on YouTube, really do create an illusion. And even with Patreon, because I cut out all the pauses and where I have to stop, let it dry, all of that is removed. It makes it feel like you should be able to do something in a couple of hours that really should take more like a couple of weeks. So don't get too big in a rush of trying to finish it overnight. Your work absolutely will suffer. Acrylics, if you want to paint things fast, do acrylics. That's something that you can get a lot done very quickly. But with colored pencils, it's a very slow medium. Keep that in mind as you're working. Don't try to rush it or expect it to be finished in a single night. It's probably not going to happen. Now, this area is time consuming only because of its size, but it's really fast or simple, I should say, as far as how I'm doing everything. I've got to pay attention to the main blocks of light and dark, but for the most part, we've just got a big tuft of fur under her chest there, and then the back of the cat is just black. I want that as dark as I can get as I move down her back. So very, very simple and working off camera because that's helpful. But the point is, I'm just blocking. Look how messy. I don't even care what direction my brush strokes go at this point. This is a base because if I want, once I come through with the highlights and the few individual chunks of fur and strands that I want to show, I need my background really, or my base, I should say, really, really dark in order for those lighter pencil strokes to show up on top of it. Now, if I were drawing a lighter cat, I would probably work, I don't know that I would start as well with the darkest colors. Even then, I think I would start with the lighter colors and build to dark. But here, because this cat is so dark, it's going to work better. I find it works better. There are a million different ways you can get to the same end, but I just find that it works better and easier to just lay these darks down. And she's got a lot of brown, this reddish brown tone too, on her fur up on under her neck here. And a bit in her face, but for now, that's why I'm going more with the dark browns, these muted browns, and then I'm going to come through as well with this reddish brown tone. So with the reddish brown, there's a few pencils that I used. I think I've got some sitting here. What colors were they? One of the main ones that I used for that reddish brown, it's called Terracotta, and that's the Derwent Drawing. Then I've got some purple in there. I just threw all the colors, just make a mess for that base, but don't push too hard, because if I push too hard here and flatten the tooth of the paper, my stage where I come through and draw the hairs on top of it, it won't be able to stick to it. When you push hard, you do what we call burnishing, and if you burnish that paper, you're jamming the pencil so far into it, and yeah, you get beautiful rich colors right away, but you can't really go on top of it. There's nothing for the pencil to stick to in that case. So that's why we want to do just lots of layers that are light to get a lot of pigment on there. Don't think that's a corner you can cut. Just push hard and now you've got more pigment, because it limits what you can do after, which we really, really don't want. And I'm just continuing these browns and purples, blacks, just blocking the color in. This is definitely one of those stages you'll look at and go, oh my gosh, this looks terrible. It's normal. It's what it's supposed to look like right now. Now, one of the things that you can't see is the clownfish that's going to go in front of her on that lower right-hand corner. I've got to be really careful around him to keep those edges clean. So that's one area that I definitely slowed down and am a bit more controlled on. Okay, so there you can see absolute scribbled mess. That is horrible. It's not going to stay there though. Let's get some more pigment on there so that when I blend, it'll be nice and dark. And there is another area where I'm holding the pencil to the side to get more surface coverage. That is with, I believe I'm using black here with the Derwent Drawing. Either black or they're chocolate brown. I think that's black. Yeah, that's black. But I need a lot of pigment still on that paper. So yeah, it's covered. I could blend with the OMS, but I'm not going to get the same results as I will going back over it again and again and again. We want lots of pigment on that paper. Now, you do not have to work in as big of an area as I'm doing. If this feels overwhelming, you can certainly break it down. And I normally recommend breaking it down to 1 or 2 square inches at a time. I'm doing this quite a bit different, mainly because her fur is so soft. So I don't have a lot of detail that I really need to focus on. It's more just where are my highlights, where are my shadows, and letting everything blend together, much like a background. But don't feel, if you start having trouble with something like this and you fill in an area as large as what I just did, 2 things happen. One, it's discouraging because you just spend a whole lot of time and it looks like absolute crap at this stage. 2, it can be a little bit overwhelming, so don't feel like you can't just break it up and do one little area at a time. I pretty much just broke it up from head and body, a much larger chunk than I typically go with. I mean, you saw that when I did the corals. I worked one coral at a time, maybe a few polyps at a time, but one coral type. So one, no, no, 2, 3, 4 square inches at a time. So we're just going to go ahead and quickly go through this. It doesn't even matter which direction my brush strokes are in this case go. This is just complete underpainting to what's going to go on there. I'm just trying to cover the white of the paper. This cat needs to be so dark. I just want to get that white covered. Now, one of the reasons that I blended out the face and then came and worked on the body is I needed the face to dry, and this allowed me to continue working on another area while the one dried instead of just having to stop and take a full break. Again, going to be careful around that clownfish. Need those edges to be nice and crisp. And this is where I really like that Derwent drawing black. I always want to say Chinese white. I'm so used to saying that because that was the main Derwent drawing pencil I used for years. But look how dark that gets so fast. It's a softer, almost, I'm trying to think of how to word it. It's like a softer black than what I would get with my polychromos. But man, that lays in there so fast. So while that dries, I'm going to go ahead and start working on her face again. So now I am starting to watch where the little hairs stick out. Where do they overlap over the background? I am pushing a bit harder on those. I went quite a bit darker than you can see on that finished one, what I'm going to want the end of her hair or her ear to look like. But in order to get those light pencils to stand out enough, I need to get the dark base there first. So I'm using that black polychromos. And so that's a method that I've really been liking when I want really dark like this. And it's not that I typically need anything to be this dark, but using the black Derwent drawing pencil, let that blend out, and then put my black polychromos on top. I really like the results that I got that way. You see, I'm pulling these purples, like it's almost a pinkish purple, so a kind of violet color or lavender. I don't know. I'm making up names. And then going back through it with the black. But now I'm starting to to block in those base really purple colors, really blue, a lot of blues. Now, a big, huge tip. Yes, we want to add highlights. Don't add extra highlights that don't belong, though. What happens, those highlights and shadows, all of that is determined by the underlying bone and muscular structure of the animal. Now, you do have a little bit more freedom, I think, to not be exact on a really long haired, poofy animal like this. But for the most part, you really do want them in pretty much the right location, because if you start putting highlights just because you thought you wanted extra highlights, it's going to change the shape of the animal and can make them look either not like the animal you're drawing or just all around deformed. So do watch that. Now, on the flip side, you can hype up the contrast of the highlights that are there. So that's not a problem at all. I will quite often make the highlights much brighter than what is in the reference photo, but they're still in the right location. I'm pretty much scribbling at this point. I'm going every which direction. Doesn't matter. I just need to get the pigment on the paper here. I might be a little bit more controlled if it was a shorter haired cat where you're going to see more of the fur, but she's so fluffy. You don't see a whole lot of individual strands on her. Some blue here. That is a really loud plane going by. Now, do I have to leave any of these colors this bright? No, and you can see that on the end result. I'm going to just keep layering and layering, but I want this richness. I want to move away from right now she has, well, besides what I've just done, she has this very gray tone to her highlights, and I want to get rid of that. And obviously, I'm not going to leave it this much purple and blue. So this is another one of those really, actually, this one pretty much goes through a scary stage until the very end, but just just a little bit here. And then here is, that was the color that I was talking about, the terracotta from the Derwent drawing. This gives me that reddish brown tone. And any of your pencils that are kind of a reddish brown, that's going to be safe, like a burnt sienna. They think you're going to get a lot more depth if you pull additional colors. Don't just use purple and blue or purple and pink. Look at how much I used in here. Violets, pink tones, kind of a pinkish purple color. Couple of different tones of blue, few different purples. I mean, a lot of colors went in here, and that terracotta color. Get the variation in there. I think it gives the piece so much more interest. And it's funny because you look at your reference photo, there were none of these colors on this cat. She didn't have purple and blue. I mean, maybe a little bit of blue picking up, but in this color, her surroundings didn't have any of these colors. Black fur is going to pick up so many of the colors around it. And she was in a room that looked like it was mostly neutral tones, grays, tans, that sort of thing. So she's not going to be reflecting a lot of the blues and such. But even if she let's say I drew her on a brown background, I may not use as much purple, but I would still use a lot of purple and blue. But here, even more so, because she's up against the coral there. Those corals are so colorful. So we want to have that reflecting on her a bit. Plus, I just like hyping up the color saturation when drawing black animals. with this purple. That is that violet from the Derwent Light Fast. I'm just going right over the blues, right over the purples, and it kind of brings those colors closer together so it's not such a harsh transition between violet to blue to magenta to whatever colors I'm using. I don't think any of the pencils I'm using are actually called any of those things, but you know, you get the idea. And if you find yourself hung up on, I just don't know what color to use, that's that right there tells you back up and use fewer colors. But don't worry too much about the color being exact. Look at how I'm just throwing these on top of it. And if you see green, grab a green. If you put it on your paper and you're like, I think it should be more of a yellow green, then either add yellow on top or grab another color that is more of a yellow green. Don't feel like if you put the wrong color down, that's what's going to make the difference and ruin your work. It has very little to do. The color itself has very little to do with how good or realistic your end result looks. I mean, look at mine. My cat is purple. That's not super realistic, but it looks like it in the end. So don't stress yourself out about the colors. Have fun with it. If you need green, grab a green. If you don't like how it looks, grab a different one. And that's why you'll so often hear me refer to colors as magenta, even though I don't know if any of my colored pencils are actually named magenta or purple. I mean, that's kind of a generalized term. We all know what purple looks like. We all know what green looks like. Grab one. If you don't like how it looks, grab a different one. But that's how you're going to get over that fear of, I don't know which color to choose. And that's a normal fear, by the way. Don't feel like there's something wrong with you or that's abnormal or anything like that. I think we all feel like that as we get started. But we have to start convincing ourselves the color's not the thing that matters the most. It's our values. How light are our lights? How dark are our darks? And of course, starting out with a solid, accurate base drawing makes a big difference too. Don't do a loose sketch and think that you're going to improve the accuracy as you start filling it in with colored pencil. It's only going to get worse. You're not going to fix that. With colored pencil especially, more so than most other mediums, your initial base drawing really does need to be pretty close to perfect before you ever start. It's just going to look less and less accurate as the pencils start hitting the paper, and you can't really erase them that easily. You can only fix so much. I mean, yeah, you can fix some mistakes with colored pencil, but only to a certain extent. If you realize, wow, my eye is the wrong size, you may or may not be able to really correct that very easily. So make sure you started out with a solid drawing. Maybe it takes you 2 days just to get your drawing accurate. That's fine. Or you can, of course, trace it, whichever you're more comfortable with. But make sure that's an accurate drawing before you ever start. And she just keeps looking worse and worse for a while here. Now see how the purple here, I've got a fairly semi-harsh start and stop. You can see where I worked on the face versus the neck. That's all going to blend together. That is one thing I really like with colored pencil is how well as you continue layering, you can bring together two areas that were done completely separate like this and it'll be seamless. So now I let that dry completely, and I can start coming back on with these highlights. So this one is the Caradosh, and most of the highlights you're going to see me doing from this point moving forward are going to either be the Derwent drawing, but not too much with that because it's a thicker, when I get into the thicker brush or pencil strokes on her neck, I'll use more of that. But the majority of these highlights that I'm going to start putting in are going to be with my luminants. And the reason for that are the luminants are going to be more opaque. They're a wax-based pencil. Because they're more opaque, they're going to show up better against that dark background. And that is that purplish tone I was just using. That's ultramarine violet. The Derwent drawing, by far going to be the most opaque, but so limited on colors. But see, as I move that pencil over the blue and the black, it really does blend in together nicely. And then coming back on top, this is another Caran d'Ache pencil. That one is the light, what is this? I cannot read the label on here. They're so freaking tiny. I think that says light cobalt blue. That pencil I used a lot. And look at how nice that stands out. So this is why when people ask if you could only have one pencil, what would you be? I don't want to choose just one because each brand has something that I love about it. Yeah, I could just use one of any one of these brands. Well, maybe except for Derwent Drawing because there's not very many colors. But I mean, give me the Derwent Lightfast, the Polychromos, or the Caran d'Ache. I can complete something beautiful by itself just with one of those pencils. But I don't want to. I really like the ability to go back and forth between a pencil that's going to be more opaque versus a pencil like the Polychromos that's sharpened to such a fine point and are so great for the tiny details. Now that ceramic knife that you saw me use last week on the coral, I tried to use that a little bit on the cat. I found that with the colors being as dark as they were, or my base layers being as dark as they were, that pencil didn't work out quite as well. Or not pencil, the ceramic knife. The ceramic knife for kind of scraping away details works best if your underlayers or base layers are light and you've put dark on top of them. So when you scrape that up, it reveals the light on top that you had on top. With the cat, it didn't work that well because I started with really dark layers. So when I tried to lift some up, it didn't expose it. There was nothing light underneath to expose, so it really wasn't super effective on the dark base layers. Worked much better with the corals where I had a light base layer and put dark the other way around. I didn't use white that much for most of the highlights. The majority of this is going to be done with this really pale blue or a pale purple. Mostly this pale blue, just because it stood out more. It wasn't even a matter of, you can see here, there's that light purple. It doesn't stand out nearly like that light blue does. And so that's really the main reason that I went more with a light blue for those highlights than a light purple. Now, I could have put white or that light blue down and then went on top with a more translucent purple, like a Polychromos. Those are going to be more translucent being the oil base. I could have gone on top of that if I wanted it to be purple. But it really didn't make a big difference. And that pencil, I mean, it looked fine just how it was. But if you were trying to get that light with a purple, then you could just go on top with, tint this color. Put this or a white down first and then purple on top. There's that black Polychromos again, darkening up some of these areas. am being careful which direction my pencil strokes go, I do want to look closely at my reference photo to make sure those are going in the right direction. And you're going to have a huge shift too in how long or short each of these pencil strokes is going to be, depending on how long or short the fur is in any given area. And I stress that because you just don't want to make a couple brush strokes, think it looks good, and repeat it everywhere. That won't look good anymore. The other thing that I'm watching for here, the fur around her face, you're going to have more of those small little individual, like you'll actually see more of your individual pencil strokes. When I get at the fur where it's softer and thicker, like the fur coming out of her ear there or the fur on her chest, I've got to watch that I don't have as many little individual pencil strokes. And see here where that fur is so short along the bridge of her nose, it's more, which is completely shaped wrong right now, but it's just solid. You don't need to try to force in strands of fur everywhere. Sometimes the fur is so short and sleek, you're just going to fill it in solid. I mean, even if I draw, let's say, an Italian Greyhound, they have such short fur. And actually, one of my dogs is a great example of this, especially her. She hardly has any fur on top of it being that short. So trying to draw in individual strands on her would make no sense. With her, you just fill in your lights and your darks. Everything's pretty smooth. My other girl has slightly longer. It's still extremely short, but more so than the other one. You're going to see a few of her individual like hair strokes on maybe her chest or her neck than you would on the other dog, but it's going to depend on the animal. So you really want to look at that individual animal and don't feel like you have to force in. Just because it has fur doesn't mean your eyes are going to see each individual strand of fur. They clump and group together, and here it's just your lights and your darks. The fur on the bridge of her nose is just as smooth as how I did her eyes, like the inside of her eyes. So don't force strands where they don't need to be. I've seen beagles where people try to put in every individual strand on their face and they end up looking like a wire hair or almost a long-haired beagle because of it. You're almost better in some of those cases to do less detail than to add too much in those like in those situations. Here's a sort of reddish brown color. This is from the Derwent Light Fast set. And I'm just slightly tinting that color, giving it kind of a brownish tone, brownish red. And I think including that brownish red color in with the purples and blues really makes a difference. And I will do that on most. If you remember the leopard I drew years ago, there was a black leopard in colored pencil, and that one had a lot of the browns in there as well, and the reddish browns. This is really where things start to look good. You go through such a long period or a long phase where everything looks absolutely terrible. As you start building up these details, now that you've got the base in, once you start building up these details, this is where things start to come together finally. Now, here's another stage that you don't want to stop at, especially the side of her face there. Just having color down doesn't mean you're finished. What I mean, as I start moving through, this is where you really start seeing a huge, huge difference. Keep layering. And don't try to make all of the bits of fur individual strands. Look at how they clump and cluster together. That is a big deal, especially on a softer, like the long haired, fluffy cats. If you try to put in too many individual strands, it'll look like her fur is oily, like she's just dirty and nasty. And so as I work through here, I start darkening a lot of things up too. So I'm not just adding highlights, I'm making my darks a lot darker going back over them. Some of these areas with the darks, I'll come in, especially when I get onto the body, you'll see this later, I'll come back through with blues on top of the black, and that will make the black look even darker. Blues, reds, when you layer other colors on top of it, it'll make it look darker than if you use just flat black. Plus you get more depth that way. Really darkening up these dark areas. Now, she's a bit more unique just based on her color. Normally, when you're drawing animals, you're not going to have areas that are this large and this just straight black. Now, if she were the only thing I was drawing, just the cat, not the fish, not the coral, actually, even with the fish would have been I could have pulled that off. But her by herself, black paper probably would have made my life a lot easier because I wouldn't even need to fill in the black. I could just let the black of the paper work for me. So if you're not painting the coral or the fish and you're just painting her or drawing her, you may want to consider working on black paper. Or do one of each. This would actually be a good project to do one of each to see which method you liked better. Your brights are going to be brighter for sure on white paper, but I don't need much bright on her. I mean, besides her eyes, and I could have pulled the highlights with that with the touch up texture titanium white mixture, so that's not even hard to get the whites back in. Now, a big thing to notice on her eye, look at here, the way that the light is hitting. You've got a shadow cast by the upper eyelid, the fur, her face right there. Make sure you get that shadow in there. That's going to make it look so much more realistic than if you just try to take the perfect color for the eye and go all the way around the iris there. Or pupil. Words are hard. But that's really what's giving that depth. And notice that's one of those areas where I don't have a sharp line. There is a very soft transition between the dark fur there and that inner corner of her eye, that upper inner corner, whatever. That's a soft, soft transition there compared to the harshness of the bright, bright, almost white outer edge up against the black fur. So that's a good example of soft versus harsh line and why and how you want to consider that. I'm going to let this smudge quite a bit because I do want her to look soft and fluffy. See how all these colors overlap. This is another reason where it makes it really hard when people say, well, I need to know the right color. Well, they're all overlapped and blended together, so there's that. That makes it a little bit more difficult. Again, not a paint by number. But yeah, I mean, all of the colors that I'm using, it's a combination of multiple colors layered on top. So you just have to start experimenting. Don't be afraid of mistakes. One of the biggest tips I can give you, do not be afraid of making mistakes or of choosing the wrong color or of doing something wrong. This is how you learn. If you want to get better at your art, you need to just take that step. Sometimes something may be a mistake. Sometimes you absolutely hate the thing that you changed. But the thing is, if there was even a consideration of should I change this, this doesn't look quite right, then obviously you want to try different things because it wasn't quite right to begin with. So even if you made it worse, it wasn't right to begin with. You didn't really hurt anything. I would rather see somebody make the mistake, like move forward, get to a point where they're like, it looks okay. I mean, it's not what I really wanted. It's not perfect, but it's okay. I would rather see you move forward and make some mistakes on that it's okay stage than to just leave it at it's okay. It's okay isn't great. You have to experiment on different things and be brave and try things that sound like they may not work out too well, but that's how you're going to find out if they will or not. That's how you're going to move your work from looking, it's okay, into, oh my gosh, I'm so happy with how this looks. The more you draw, the more you experiment for sure, the easier all of that is going to get. So if right now you're in that stage where you just are almost paralyzed with fear of making a mistake, just keep drawing. The more you do, the easier it's going to be. And I think part of that too goes down to, or comes down to, when you've only drawn a handful of things, you want every single thing you've done to be like the next greatest, the next best thing you've ever done. It doesn't really work that way. I mean, I've got probably more paintings I don't like than I have that I do really like of my own. But that's how you get to those stages of those paintings that you really, really like. You've got to make a few that you don't like so much. Don't That's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean you messed anything up or did anything wrong. That's a part of the learning process. And it's a good thing. When you hit those stages where you made something, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to do that again. That's amazing. You just learned a pretty big lesson on something not to do. That's as important as learning what to do. The other thing that I often hear is, well, I don't want to waste my supplies. I don't want to waste my papers or waste the good paper or waste the good pencils. Well, when they're sitting there not doing anything, I would call that a much bigger waste than drawing something that didn't work out. You can see I'm going really dark here. I'm actually pushing pretty hard. You can tell because of the way the easel's moving there. I am adding a lot more pressure with that drawing black. I need to order more of those. That one is getting low. But I'm pushing pretty hard here because this is just as dark as it's going to go. You know, really dark. Going to put a blue on top of that too, though. Now, this one is definitely a little bit harder to photograph. I had to get it in just the right lighting because the blacks are really, and I'm not sure if it's just, I don't see it as much when I use polychromos more for black, but with this much of the Derwent drawing, it really was picking up and getting a little bit of a foggy look on the black, depending on the lighting that I had it under. So I need to make all this really dark in order for those lights to stand out. So I'm going to go through that really quick. Look how blotchy and messy. It's totally fine for this. But again, depending on the paper and pencils you're using, you may not get the same results. You may have to alter your technique a bit. And have definitely been, well, the old Fabriano would be one. Stonehenge, it depends how much pigment I have on there, which pencils. But I mean, some of the papers that I've used, if I was this scribbly and this messy, I wouldn't be able to blend it out. But it also depends on the color. Lighter colors, I have a much harder time. Like if I were doing a portrait and I left the skin, like let's say it was a light colored person, if I left the skin that blotchy, it's not going to blend out super well. And again, the pencils I'm using make a difference. But this paper, these pencils, I'm able to make an absolute mess and it will all blend. These colors, or I should say almost more values than colors, just the fact that they're dark. There's with the blue that I'm going over a lot of that black, just so it'll be slightly tinted when I blend out. And then back to the black. blending all of that out. Now here I do need to watch the direction that my brush stroke is going. I kind of want to move this the direction that the fur would be because it does get a little bit streaky with how much pigment I have on that brush. Again, still keeping that clownfish really clean. Don't want to be messy around him. So this is finally going to give me a dark enough base layer that the lights, the highlights that I want to put on top are going to show up really well. But without this being dark enough, it wouldn't have shown up. I just wouldn't have gotten the contrast. Now, I could have added highlights on the more muted tone and then come back in between with the darks, like I do to an extent here, but this really, I think, saves a lot of time and gives me the look that I'm going for. That pencil. There's an example. That pencil didn't work out. I put a couple brush strokes in, or pencil strokes, and it's like, nope, that one didn't work either. It wasn't light enough. But see, I do it all the time. It's not like I just automatically know exactly which colors to use. If you try something, it doesn't work, try something else. So there I'm back to that blue. That blue just stood out so well. Now these strands are a little bit on the stringy side, so I need to make sure that I overlap them so that they start to soften out. See how I'm overlapping these more muted tones right on top of those? This kind of blends it together, along with adding a bit of extra detail. And you'll see you keep trying different pencils, and it's like, no, it didn't stand up. Try it, didn't show up enough. Try a different one. Now watch how I start building this fur into the clump and cluster thing. This is where you really want to watch that you don't have too many individual strands. If you do, that fur will look wiry and oily or dirty. It won't have that soft look that we want. And part of the softness I'm going to get by smudging the colors together just by going over it with odorless mineral spirits. In that case, I'm not doing it necessarily because I need to blend things out, but it just softens. It kind of muddies things together a bit, which gives me that softer feel that I want for the fur there. And see how all of these brush strokes, or I keep saying brush strokes, pencil strokes, look at how they're not all the same. Where do they turn and twist and change directions? See, right now, she looks stringy. We do not want to leave it looking like this. This is a good example of what I was talking about that we want to avoid. At least for the final result. Now look how subtle when I get into the really dark areas. I just need a little bit of a hint of the detailing in there. Most of that's going to stay solid black. Come back through with some darker browns here. It's kind of a reddish brown. Now notice that I don't have any glassine under my hand. That's because I'm not resting my hand here. I don't need fine details. I'm being very loose and my hand is away from the easel. So there I'm using that violet, or which one is that? That's the really dark one. Yeah, that one is violet. And then I've also, we'll go back and forth between that and Nightshade with the Derwent Light Fast pencils. Because that will sometimes, using that purple or the darker blues, it'll on top of the black, it'll make it look darker than just putting more black on top of the black. It gives it so much more depth. It's not depth. It's subtle, but it really does make a big difference in the overall, like when you really view this in person. It really looks a lot better than just straight black everywhere. Now the majority of this area is black, but you can see I'm putting the purple on top and it'll just give it that little bit of extra punch. See, I'm pulling this purple and black that I'd added on, letting that blend up with the lighter portions of the fur right around her neck. Here's where I tried with that ceramic knife. It just didn't really do anything. I tried in a couple of areas, and so that's where I realized, yeah, that's definitely one I'm going to keep, where I've got the light underpainting and then the heavier darks on top. That's where it really gave me the best results. Not so much on the cat. A little bit in there, not much. And purple is one of those colors. I put it all over her chest. I put it all over where it wasn't really in the reference photo at all, but it makes such a difference. And one of the things that I did on her towards the end, it was actually after I came on top with the touch up texture titanium white mixture, I had screwed up her pupils. They were not quite right, but I knew they weren't right, but I was having a hard time seeing it. I flipped the reference photo and I flipped my drawing upside down, and suddenly it was like, oh, okay, I see what went wrong. This is easy to fix. Now I can see it. But you flip stuff upside down, especially portraits are one of the biggest ones that I do this with. But something seems off, you know it's off, but you're not seeing, like, I don't, does it need to be moved to the left, to the right? I don't know what's off here. Flip it upside down. It is amazing how much easier it is to see and correct things when you're trying to get something more like your reference photo. And in the case of portraits, that's a big deal. It was one of those where I hit a stage where I just kept messing with it, but it still didn't look right. And I had to flip it over, and then it just jumped out at me. There's the problem. You see, I'm pulling this black and breaking up the rough around her chest there, cleaning up those edges. But they're in chunks, like clumps and clusters of fur there. Don't try to make them a bunch of teeny tiny individual strand details. You want a few individual strands that stick out. You absolutely do. Just not all of them. Now I'm putting blue over the black. See, I keep pulling these colors over it, and man, does it make a difference. Now, if you're looking at that, like you're working on stuff and you're like, I can't really tell the difference that I put black over the or blue over the black, it looks the same to me. The more you paint and draw, the more you start noticing those differences. At first, you're probably not going to notice that big of a difference. You're going to start, the more you paint and draw, you're going to start noticing things you never noticed before. So you may look at a reference photo and have somebody, I would see this all the time when I was teaching classes, where somebody would ask for help, something was going wrong, or whatever reason, I would go over to help them. And I could point out, okay, we need to change this, we need to make that look more like this to the reference photo. And students would say so often, how did you even notice that? I didn't even see that. That comes from time. I didn't used to see any of that stuff. I used to really, be in that same place of, I don't even know how these artists are noticing these details. That comes from time and just, paying attention, trying to notice more constantly. You will get to that stage where you start really noticing stuff, but that only comes from painting and drawing more. It doesn't matter how many books you read. It doesn't matter how many videos you watch. If you're not going to that easel and you're not spending time painting and drawing, you're not going to hit that point where you start noticing more. That only comes from practice. And I think so often, especially new artists, hit that stage where they think, I want my work to look super realistic, and they do one or two drawings. They don't look super realistic. Think, well, I guess I'm not good at this. I can't do this. Well, no, you've only done a few drawings. That takes years to really get to that point. So just don't give up if this is something you're really interested in achieving. That comes from time and from practice. So here I'm using the white luminance pencil because those whiskers in the background, I don't want them super, super bright. Little eyelashes there, or not eyelashes, eyebrows. Now these ones don't show up well enough. I've got so much pigment on the paper and I did burnish quite a bit of this. So see how that pencil doesn't really, it shows up a little bit, but I still want to go ahead, get some in. And so basically I'm just lightening up what colors are already there. I'm not making this white. I'm going to come through with my Touch Up Texture titanium white mixture after and go over some of these just for the lighter areas. I don't need my whiskers to be all straight as white as I can be. And if you don't have Touch Up Texture titanium white mixture for that, just push harder with your pencil. I would try with the Derwent drawing will give you a more obvious white. But I definitely get the best results using the Touch Up Texture titanium white mixture. And the reason I haven't used it yet is I'm just saving it until I get everything to the stage where I can, anywhere that's going to need it, I can do it all at once. Because that stuff isn't something that you can mix and then come back 20 minutes later and reuse it. It dries so fast. So you just want to mix a small amount. And I like to wait until I'm doing it on a large, in this case, everywhere she's going to need it. I'm going to do it all at once so I don't waste as much product. And if you are buying that product, I find that I go through, I don't think I've gone through a single entire jar of the titanium white, the powder, but the liquid stuff, the touch-up texture, that's the stuff I go through the fastest. So if you're going to order that, I would probably order a couple extra of those. And then I just use a synthetic hog-haired liner brush. Really, any liner brush is going to work, but I use a liner brush to paint on where I want those highlights. And once it dries, I can put color on top of it. I don't have to leave it white. And it adds tooth to the paper anywhere where I paint it. So it's going, any color I want to paint on or draw on top of it's going to stick really well. You just have to make sure it dries all the way. So this is a darker blue. You can see me going over some of the other highlights. Doesn't really show up too much over the black, but when I put it on top of an area where there was already a highlight, then it shows up pretty well. Like there. Okay, so I mixed my Touch Up Texture titanium white mixture. I'm brightening up the highlight in her eye. And I've got a video showing you how to mix that, how to use that stuff. I'll put a link to that in the description. But I'm using it like paint. Now, the reason you can't just use acrylic paint or a white gel pen, I've had people ask about that. Those aren't archival. Those are going to not stick long term. That's not good if you're selling your work. It's not the way that you want to go. So you definitely want to go with an archival product. And this really is the only one that is going to work well on top of the wax and oil-based pencils. It's intended or made for this. And here you can really see something went terribly wrong with that eye in the background. It is not quite, I pulled the highlight up too far and the pupil's not quite right. So that's where I ended up, I didn't do it on camera. I just turned it upside down, turned everything off so I could really focus on what I needed to correct. I'll do that in a bit. Now, if you're going to take your pencil and go on top of the Touch Up Texture titanium white mixture, make sure it dries for a good 10-20 minutes. It depends on the humidity, but you want that to be really, really dry, because if it's not, it'll feel dry to the touch, but it can kind of flake up if you put the pencil, a hard pencil on top of it, if it's not dry all the way. It should not chip up if it's dry all the way. Few extra details in there around the eye. Using a lot of the purple over the darker black, or any of the shadows really. I'm taking that purple right over those. Now I can start coming through. Now that I'm getting towards the end, I'm going to refine a few of these extra details. Little bits. And this is a good stage, honestly, to just take a break. If you've been like with me, I had sat in front of that easel for so long that you start to kind of lose sight of things. You start not noticing as many details. So take a break if you need to, come back the next day, and then finish everything up. I usually will get to the stage where I think it's all done and then come back the next day and really finish it. It may only take an extra 20 minutes, but just to come back with fresh eyes makes a big difference. See how I overlap though and start really creating these clusters, not just individual brush strokes, pencil strokes, whatever, some kind of stroke. Now here, I'm not blending because the pencils look rough or have that grainy gritty look. I'm blending because I want the colors to slightly smudge together on her chest, well, anywhere, so that she looks softer. And apparently we're going to take a break. Where did I go? There we go. I really like a lot of the Derwent drawing pencils when they work, when there was a color that I could use. It works well for just getting this really soft look. And especially when I go through and blend over it, they smudge together a lot more than most of the other pencils. More of that reddish brown. And notice how when I add the reddish brown, it makes the purple, it makes everything else just stand out a bit more, which is weird. You'd think it would tone it down, and it doesn't. It just being next to it, it adds so much more color. Or it almost looks like my color saturation in general went up. See, just smudging those together. And it really just depends on the coat type of the animal, how much of this smudging you want to do. See, I'm going to take blue over these whiskers on the ends so that it's not just white start to finish. Using just the white to pull out some of those highlights. And this is where I think that I may, once I get the fish in, I need to see if I want her to have more highlights on her chest there, because the reference photo calls for it. It's just that I'm not sure that that's drawing the attention really where I want it to on her. And I'm not going to know for certain until I get those fish drawn in. Once those fish are in, I may come back and add a few more details on her. We'll see what additional changes I may want to make to balance everything out as a whole. Whenever you're doing something surreal like this, it isn't just about getting a reference photo and copying that reference photo completely. You've got to find a way to balance each individual element so that it all fits together. So we'll come back to her, or possibly, maybe I'll leave it exactly how it is. I won't know until those fish are in, but we will have the finish of this with the fish and the sea dragon next week.